Tonight, I have a special guest in the house, and we're going to talk a little bit about the role of African Americans in today's society. I have my friend and friend to the show, Mr. Clarence Featherson, and we are going to jump right into it. Good afternoon, good evening, sir. How are you?
Good evening. I am Dynamite, and thank you for having me on. In the end, we win. Curtis, thank you.
Absolutely.
Glad to be here.
So Clarence is an attorney, Clarence Featherson, by the way. He has been on the board of Return to the Source. And Clarence, if you would, just let our viewers know what exactly Return to the Source is.
So Return to the Source it was an organization in Washington, D.C., cultural, educational organization that was designed for the study, the advancement, and the promotion of African American and African culture. Okay. And the organization gets its name, Return to the Source, from the title of a book by Amilcar Cabral, who was president of West African country in the time of its independence. And he was the president of Guinea and helped steer them through fights against the Portuguese when they were a colony of the Portuguese,
sure,
and then into independence.
Okay. And how long were you on the board there?
I was on the board for several years.
Gotcha. And from that, you've acquired, obviously, a ton of knowledge in order to be able to sit on the board, first of all. And I think that's ultimately why I'd like to have you on tonight, because I'm struggling. I'm struggling with understanding how we're still having unarmed black men being shot down when, in 2018, it just baffles me as to how folks can run into a church and shoot everyone up and walk out alive. And you have a young man who, though running from the police, in one instance, here recently within the last 2 weeks, I was named Stephon Clark out in Sacramento, running from the police, but ends up getting shot over 20 times, and they speculate that he had a handgun. That baffles me, and I'm a little concerned about that. So I just wanted to have you on to help not just myself understand, but our viewers perhaps get a better understanding of our role as African Americans in today's society. Do you have any input on that?
Yeah, I think the reason you brought me on is I did a session at work for Black History Month.
Yes.
And the title of the session was, "In a Post-Racial America, is there still a need for Black History Month?"
Sure.
And I deliberately titled it, "In a Post-Racial America," because I wanted to get people's attention. There are some people who believe because we had a black president who was elected, because we had a black attorney general, that we really don't need, number one, to continue to have a special month set aside for African Americans, and then secondly, that we have crossed some kind of threshold that now we are treated as fairly and as equally as other groups in America. Mm-hmm. And I think the issue that you raised shows that, number one, we haven't reached a post-racial America.
No.
That the killing of black men by police officers, in particular unarmed black men, is an example of one of the reasons why we need to continue to understand our history, because if we look at our history, what we're experiencing now is really not new.
That's right.
But what's happened is, before you had internet TV, before you had 24-hour cable, a lot of people don't realize, before CNN, which really took off during Operation Desert Storm in 1991 or so, you didn't have 24-hour news. So what would happen, a killing in the West Coast, a killing in Florida, we may not even hear about it until years, weeks, months later. And by then, it's just a few lines in the newspaper.
Sure.
When you see something visually, it affects you. It makes people who may not believe what they're seeing understand that what they're seeing is real, in real time. Rodney King.
That's
so
right.
Had it not been for Rodney King, being videotaped, his
That's right.
beating by the hand at the hands of those police officers, then what people would have said is he provoked them. He was the big black man who was always threatening and intimidating. And in a little while we can talk about that, because if you understand the role of the perception of black people in this country historically, we tend to be depicted as dangerous,
That's right.
as the outsider,
That's right.
as the person who is willing to cause problems. We are the problem. And so when they saw the Rodney King beating, even people who might have been inclined to give police the benefit of the doubt, which is usually what happens in this country, it was there. There was no denying it. And so I think what we're seeing now with 24-hour broadcasting, with the internet TV, with YouTube, with everyone having cell phones and video cameras readily available, we are now seeing the brutality and some of the unarmed shootings that have always existed, but that most people were not aware of. And, you know, after I talked to you yesterday and you mentioned some of the things we were going to talk about, I just went to the internet and just Googled in blacks shot and killed by police officers. And what I found out was that it's essentially we're being shot and killed 2.5 times the rate of whites. So African Americans make up 24% of the people fatally shot and killed by police officers, even though we're only about 13% of the population. Whereas whites are 63% of the population, but they're only 49% of those killed by police. So what you're getting is a big discrepancy in the shooting and the killing by police officers of one group of people versus another. And one of the reasons has to do with how blacks are perceived in America, how we are treated, and the fact that we had a black president elected. For the regular folks on the street, for you, for I, that really hasn't impacted or changed the way.
It has not, or
it has not. It has not.
Because we were going to talk about that as well.
But it's not in terms of, if you look, the police shootings, the killings, particularly when you have people, and I'm not second guessing policemen. Policemen, firemen, teachers, they don't get paid enough. And
Definitely.
I think what happens is that you have a small group who they give the larger group a bad name.
Okay.
And what most people don't also realize is that in the course of their career, most police officers never discharge their gun once. Most don't.
Okay.
So you've got a small number of officers who are in jump out squads, who are in tactical squads. They're in activities where they're going to need to fire more. But the question is, again, why this discrepancy between the number of blacks who are shot and killed and our numbers in the overall population?
Have you looked into why? Have you come up with a logical explanation as to why? Because I hear a lot of training. I hear a lot about training. What one agency does here on the East Coast may not be the same as what an agency does on the West Coast. So the training is not universal, if you will.
Training is not universal. But I think the police, when they go home at night, they take off their badges. They're people like everyone else. So they look at black people the same way that most other Americans look at black people. They have been conditioned by this society. I was stopped several years ago up in Wheaton, Maryland, and the officer said, first thing he asked me, and I had never had this happen, and usually I'm very calm because I have had several incidents of where I've been pulled over for DWB, that's driving while black. But in this one, there was no trying to find a real justification for why I was stopped. The first thing the officer said was, when he pulled me over, was, "Are you on parole?"
Wow.
Not, do you know that you have a headlight out, that you're missing something? Are you on parole? Now,
is it safe for my audience to assume that this was a white officer that pulled you over?
It was a white officer. It was a white officer. Now, I've had encounters with black police officers, but they're generally different. I have been followed leaving neighborhood stores where I live. And you know, when a police officer is behind you for about a half a mile, before you are pulled over. Then you begin to say, well, what is it that took a half a mile? What is happening sometimes is that your tags are being run, your tags, other things, and they're outstanding.
That's right.
Ticket warrants, tickets, other things. And then
to know what they're going to get into.
And then in Montgomery County, what happened is several years ago, because of incidents between police officers and a disproportionate number of black drivers being pulled over, the county agreed to keep track of the race and ethnicity of people who were stopped for traffic violations. So the one time that the officer followed me for about a half a mile, and I was pulled over, I was told, as usually is the case, there's a headlight that's out, or maybe your rear brake light is not blinking correctly. And so after my license is run through the system, I'm let off with the warning, but not a written warning, because the written warning would trigger a record for the race of the people who were pulled over and stopped. And again, and I'm not saying this is all the time. I've had some incidents with white officers where people have been polite and there was something legitimately, maybe it was a rolling stop.
Sure.
But again, I think in the time that I just mentioned where I was followed for about a half a mile, what was interesting is when I gave my license, it showed that I lived in the neighborhood where I had been followed from. And then everything changed. So everything changed because, okay, I guess I proved that I had a right
to be where
I am. And I think, and again, this gets back to, is there still a need for Black History Month? Because what we see is how have black people from the time we were first brought here been seen by the larger society, and the police officers and the way we're treated tend to reflect that. And I think we use history as a scorecard, a report card, to show where we've been, where we're going. And if you look at our history, a lot of the problems that we're facing now, we have faced in the past.
That's right.
So we tend to have periods of progress where we may take 3 steps forward, and then there's a backlash, and then we have to take 2 steps back. And so it's a constant struggle to make progress. And when we do make progress, in a way we're penalized for making progress because we're trying to get ahead. And I think some of what we're seeing also in terms of the treatment and the attitudes that are being voiced from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, if you remember, not several months ago, a police officers association was told essentially, if you're putting people in the squad car, it's okay to rough them up. It's okay to bang their heads. So I think officers are being told essentially that you have permission to shoot first, ask questions later, and that you are basically going to be giving a pass in a lot of situations because this is the mood of some of the people in power, and not everyone. And I think that in some jurisdictions that the community, the police officers association, the executives are on top of that. And so they're working to prevent that kind of mentality, because it only takes a few bad apples to make all of the whole policing effort seem like an occupation force to the people when they encounter police.
Sure. So, guests, as you hear, we have jumped right into this conversation tonight, but I am also opening up the lines for you guys to call in. You can call in and join in on the conversation by dialing 240-719-2560. Again, 240-719-2560, and you can get in on the conversation with my guest, attorney Clarence Featherson, and we're going right along with it. Now, Clarence, you mentioned earlier about perception. How real is this thing about perception in the mindset of white America, in your mind, and our current president? Because I remember when he made those statements about it being okay to rough them up and so on. Even in those rallies we saw where he made comments from the pulpit. How do you view his role in this perception piece?
I think what he's essentially done, and if you've noticed, we've had more racially motivated attacks. We've just had more mass slayings. I think what's happened is one of the things that the president's office can do is be a moral compass for this country. This moral compass is broke. There is no appeal to people to put aside their prejudices, their racism, their bigotry, their hatred. If anything, they are being given permission to take out whatever sheets they had in the closet. If they haven't gotten sheets, if they don't have them in the closet, to go out and buy some. I bet no one's probably checked the number of records, but I bet you there's probably been an increase in the number of orders for Klan robes since the president was elected, and the companies that make them probably made in China, because very few things are made in America today. But they are probably doing a booming business. If you look at what happened in Charlottesville, and the woman who was killed was white.
Yes.
But what the president said when asked to condemn the alt-right, the white supremacists, the Nazi supporters, he said, and I quote, there are good and bad people on both sides. Yeah. Would you have said that with regards to World War II, there are good and bad people with the Nazis and the Americans? With the Japanese who bombed Pearl Harbor, were there good and bad people on both sides there? Right is right and wrong is wrong. And I think there's a difference when people who are marching against racism, against discrimination, against prejudice, than people who are marching to put those things back in place. And when you hear words like "Make America Great Again," well, what exactly does that mean? Great for who?
Right.
Great,
Definitely.
Great for who?
Right.
Right. As I look around the studio, there's a picture on the wall of our gang. And for those, I'm giving my age, who are younger out there and don't know it, go on YouTube and look up Our Gang. But what was different about that show at the time was they had a black character, and he was treated as a part of the group. But if you look at almost any other show in the 40s and the 50s, even in the 60s, it was like America had no black people. Right. So the Native Americans were portrayed by white people. The Asians were often portrayed by white people. And then you had a show such as Mayberry, Andy Griffin. And I'm trying to find out where there are towns in North Carolina where you don't even see a black person crossing the street, loading the bag, sweeping the stores. But that is the type of America that I think some people want to go back to, where African American folks, like children, really weren't even seen, let alone not heard.
Is it possible to get this equality? To get this thing that we're searching after?
You know, I think that's an excellent question. I think one of the things, and again, what history does is it gives us a best practices sort of lesson to learn what has worked in the past. It also lets us look at where we've come from, where we're going, what we've overcome, and how much lies ahead to be done. I think, as the title of the show is, in the end we win.
That's right.
We will win.
That's right.
But again, I think what happens is, and this is why I'm really keen on understanding history, is for those young people who probably didn't grow up or understand some of the harsh, ugly racism of the 50s and the 60s. So they've never seen the signs white only. They've never seen some of the segregated facilities where they simply, and this happened in Washington, this D.C., this happened in Prince George's County, Montgomery County. Montgomery County didn't have its first high school for black students until 1924, and then they only had one. They would pay, or they would have this black students in Montgomery County either come into, might have been Capitol Heights in Prince George's County, or go to the district. But the point is, in the past, we've had to deal with all types of oppression, hostility, and I'm sure people back then wondered, will we win in the end? But one of the things they realized is we have to keep persevering, we have to keep trying. And so for those who've grown up, and I think what happened is once people saw that they had a black president, they realized, because that was something I never thought I would see in my lifetime, that if we are able to reach that, then the sky is the limit. But what we also have to realize is, again, he was one person.
That's right.
There's a small group of black people who've done very well, and then there are a lot of us who are struggling and just trying to get to the next level. And it's going to take a process. It's going to take time. So we have been in this country over 500 years. A lot of people don't understand that the first permanent British settlement in North America was in 1607 at Jamestown. Christopher Columbus came into the New World in 1492. He was lost, thought he was in India, which is why the people are called Indians. But on that trip with this guy who was lost were black people on his ship. And not just the slaves, but as the pilots. He was relying on people. Right. So the oldest American city continuously occupied is St. Augustine, Florida, found in 1519. America was largely Spanish before it was British, and when the Spanish came, there were Africans with them. They were soldiers, they were explorers, as well as slaves. And so that in terms of the time frame, we've been struggling for over 500 years for freedom, justice, and equality. We're making progress. There have been setbacks after the Civil War. Sure. We had a period of time called Reconstruction, where we had black senators, we had black congressmen, we had black businesses. And then you had, as you had after the Obama presidency, you had that backlash. That was when you began to really see separate but equal. You began to see attacks on black voters. There was lynching, there were bombings, there was domestic terrorism. People don't understand that what we're seeing now in terms of some of the mass shootings, the killings, that has a long history in America.
In our country.
H. Rap Brown said that violence is as American as apple pie. And unfortunately, so is racism. But that doesn't mean because those things are part of a history that we can't overcome them.
Right.
It just means we have to understand it's not going to be easy. I think the words that really characterize the African American experience in this country is overcoming struggle and perseverance. And that's where we are today. We're still in that mode. We're trying to persevere. We will overcome, but we have to understand that what we're going through is part of a process. And freedom isn't free.
No.
There's a price to be paid.
Right. I find it interesting that today we have these, in fact, this past weekend we had these rallies all over the country by students. I'm talking high school students, and then obviously there were adults who filtered into it, but I think a lot of people forget that some of the movements of the past in regards to racism and just standing up for the rights of African American people had also started by students, college students, high school students, and so on, because they're just getting frustrated with.
No, that's right. And I'll just use a couple of quick examples. So that in the civil rights movement, there were the children's marches.
That's right.
Where they were actually, one of the strategies that they used in the South was to fill the jails with children, because people react differently when they see children being bitten, and it took a lot of courage. When they saw children being bitten by police dogs, being hosed, when they saw the children being lined up. So Brown versus Board of Education was 5 separate cases that were consolidated, challenging separate but equal in education.
Right.
One of those cases came out of Virginia, and I think it was Farmville, Virginia, but it was the high school students who went out on strike. They were in dilapidated buildings in their Negro school system, and they refused to listen to the principal, to their Board of Education,
right.
And they convinced the NAACP in Richmond to be one of those 5 cases that became Brown versus Board of Education. The other thing is, when you talk about young people, so the people we think of today, Eleanor Holmes Norton,
sure.
Late Marion Barry, mayor for life, they got their start in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, as well as Congressman Lewis. And so at that time, we see them now as older adults,
sure.
part of the system, but they were firebrands. They were young, they were full of enthusiasm,
sure.
and it was SNCC in particular who forced the older people in the SCLC sometimes to take actions that they may not have taken. But that was the importance of the youth. The youth had the energy and the drive to actually go out there and to say, we are tired and we're not going to take it anymore. And one of the things I think that's important is that with SNCC, they had Ella Baker, who was working with SCLC, who was older as their advisor. So what you had is you had the passion and the fire and the energy of the youth with some of the advice from an older person who also had some life experiences so that they could work together, the two of them. And SNCC, as well as SCLC and Martin Luther King, really produced some of the changes that we benefit from today. And the other thing I just want to say is African American history is American history.
Definitely.
Without African American history, you wouldn't have American history.
Absolutely.
I think it's not something that you just restrict to 1 month a year. I celebrate it, I learn, I embrace it, I talk about it 12 months a year. And then any issue in American society that you want to talk about, labor, the struggle for religious freedom, the struggle for the First Amendment, association, freedom of the press, all of those are contained within the struggle for freedom, justice, and equality that African Americans have fought for. So that the women's movement, the Chicano movement, the gay pride movement, all of those took their cues from the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. So whether it's music, and a lot of people don't know, and I asked during the session at work, I said, and Rolling Stones was one of the premier rock groups of the 60s. I said, can someone tell me where they got their name from? And people didn't know. They got it from a Muddy Waters tune, like a Rolling Stone. There he is right there, Muddy Waters, so that they got their inspiration. The Beatles took their name from Buddy Holly and the Crickets, who were inspired by people like Little Richard, as well as Jerry Lee Lewis. And so without R&B, soul music, and the blues, you wouldn't have had rock and roll. And without rock and roll, you wouldn't have had rock. And just whatever. And again, the perseverance, the struggle. People don't realize there was a time when blacks were not allowed, it's hard to believe, in the National Basketball Association.
Sure, right.
Yeah. People know that Jackie Robinson broke the color line in baseball in 1947. But for professional basketball, it was after that. Now, imagine an NBA that is now, I think, about 75% black with no black players. With no black players. Think of the Washington Redskins with no black players. They were, I believe, the last of National Football League teams to integrate, and they did not do it voluntarily. They did it because RFK Stadium was on federal property, and in order to get the lease renewed, the Secretary of the Interior, who controlled that property, told them they had to integrate the team. And that is one reason why you see a lot of Dallas fans in Washington, because of the Redskins' treatment and attitude towards black athletes at that time.
Oh, Jesus. Oh, Jesus. I think he just challenged me to change my football team. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's we're about halfway through the show. I'm asking you all to please call in. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, you'd just like to join the conversation, you can do that at 240-719-2560. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in roughly 2 minutes. Thank you all, and see you shortly. have just been beat up on, and I've been given an application for a Dallas Cowboy fan club. I'm refusing the Cowboys because I've built a disdain. I've built a disdain against them for all of these years. So we're going to consider maybe the Philadelphia Eagles. I don't know. But anyway, welcome back, everyone. You have tuned in to the End We Win with Curtis. I've got my guest, my friend to the show, Clarence Featherson, and we are knee deep in a conversation that's challenging even the history books that we grew up on. You are encouraged to call in. You can do so at 240-719-2560. I encourage you to call if you have any questions or if you just want to just chime in on the conversation. We encourage you to do that. We're going to continue the conversation. So you mentioned President Obama, and I have a question. What do you think about if he was to have become, or we had a, let's use that, if he himself had become president in a different era, maybe the 60s, the 70s, or the 80s, do you think he would have been more impactful?
I don't think he could have been president in a different era.
Okay, but
so.
if all of the stars and the moons and the suns aligned.
See, here's the thing. I don't think they could have aligned, and this is why I'm such a proponent of history. You have to understand how one thing leads to another. So let's look at America, for instance. After World War II, you started to see little bits of finally progress from the federal government towards taking a position on civil rights, on integration. So what you had is in 1947, I believe it was, Truman issued an executive order that said we will have integration in the armed forces. Now, he didn't give a specific date. He just said that the forces would decide how soon and to what extent it was possible. In World War II, as the United States was fighting Nazi Germany with its ideas of racism and white supremacy, the black soldiers who were fighting in Germany were also dealing with some of the same issues that Germany was trying to propagate in Europe, right here in America.
Okay.
So that the Tuskegee Airmen, people may know of now, they didn't know at the time, was an attempt by the United States to give black men finally a chance to prove their manhood and fight. Now, after World War II, there was the Cold War. So we are now, the United States, in competition with Russia for the heart and soul of the world. Particularly if you look at the mineral resources that are available in Africa, they were then, they still are today, that are needed for producing a lot of the things that we use in our society, for the oil in the Middle East, for a lot of the products that were in India. So those nations were called the Afro-Asian nations. The United States would say, we are your friend. We want to show you democracy. Russia would point to the lynchings of servicemen who came home in uniform and were dragged off the bus and were killed or beaten, and they would broadcast it in newspapers. They would say to the world, how can they be the defenders of democracy when they treat their own people so badly that in the nation's capital, the stores, the schools are segregated? The Russians would say, we don't practice that. Well, they had their form of segregation, but it was not written into law the way it was in the South. So in the South, in the constitutional codes of states, you had separate but equal. Not equal, actually. You just had the separation was mandated by law. It makes it very hard to tell the world that you're a proponent of democracy, that you want to help them when you haven't begun to help your people at home.
That's right.
And so the steps that the United States took, when after the Brown versus Board of Education was decided, the federal troops having to help the students get into Little Rock High School in Arkansas, all those were forced in some ways upon the president. Eisenhower reluctantly did that. The confrontations with the integration of the University of Alabama by Vivian Malone, and I can't think of the male student, she graduated. The black male, two students, they're depicted in the scene in Forrest Gump when the troops are there and they're having to get into class, and also people might have seen the clips where George Wallace is blocking the door when they're trying to get in, and he's saying segregation today, segregation forever. And they had worked something out with the Kennedy administration where he would do that. They would bring federal troops. There would be a backing down. But the point is, to the world was watching. Right. So that the steps that were taken, the small steps then were necessary to begin to show the world why they should trust the United States. But that didn't mean that America itself, that the voters had changed. In 1968, a lot of people don't know this, George Wallace, who was running as a Democrat, but on a states' rights platform, won the Democratic primary in Maryland.
Oh, wow.
That's right. That was 68. So I don't see if George Wallace and then Richard Nixon won on the law and order platform, which basically meant get the hippies, the Black Panthers, the SNCC people, and all those civil rights protesters and the anti-war people and the SDS students, get them off the streets, get them out of town, get them wherever, but just get them away from here. And we want law and order. And so I don't think that the time would have been right. Shirley Chisholm ran for president in 72, and she could not get much support even among black elected officials, because the first thing politicians always want to do is they want to get reelected. That's the reality. They're not religious leaders. Politicians want to get reelected. They tend to want to go with the winners, and they did not see her as being a viable candidate. Then let's look at Jesse Jackson. So Jesse Jackson articulated a lot of good ideas. He was a progressive politician, but you also have to look at his style. So Jesse was very forceful. He was outspoken. And Jesse, a lot of people remembered him when he had the dashikis, when he had the afros. And that scared a lot of your white voting electorate. Now, let's compare that to Barack Obama. Barack Obama grew up in Hawaii. So his style is not really confrontational. His style is it's a calming, he's a diplomatic person. And so I think, though, what had happened is that Jesse's, even though he was not successful in his bid for the presidency, because he did win 20% of the Democratic primary the second time he ran for office, it showed that there could be a viable black presidential candidate. But things happened step by step. And so that I think had Barack run in the 60s, it wouldn't have happened. Now, I'll just give you a perfect example. Everyone knows about Martin Luther King, and I wouldn't say everyone, but a lot of people, the Montgomery bus boycott. He was chosen to lead the boycott by the other church leaders in the city because the feeling was that whoever led the boycott, if he pulled it off, would become one of the most important religious leaders, and they were afraid of who would get that power and prestige. And here's the new kid in town. Well, the church that Martin Luther King was now pastor of, he had replaced a man named Vernon Jordan.
Yes.
Vernon Johns, that most people aren't aware of. He tried to do a lot of the same things that Martin Luther King has become known for. Boycotts, confronting police brutality, a number of things, but the times were not right for him. And ultimately, the board removed him, and they brought in who they thought was going to be a less confrontational, a more middle-class, steadfast Negro preacher, third-generation Negro preacher, and someone who would maintain the status quo. The congregation was basically middle-class. They didn't want someone to ruffle people's feathers.
Sure.
After World War II, you had black veterans coming back. People who had fought overseas and fought for the rights of the United States were less likely to want to be pushed around here. And so the country, people, they have to be prepared for change. It doesn't happen overnight. And this gets back to the theme you were talking about. Are we ever going to reach a point in time when we have equality? I think, yes, we will, but it's going to be a long time coming. But if we understand that, and then if we look at what we've survived, the Middle Passage, being captured, our ancestors in Africa, being put on ships, being beaten, being whooped, being sold, even after freedom, second-class citizenship, fighting, perseverance, struggle. That's what we've done for the whole time we've been here. And so I don't really see why anything all of a sudden is going to change. I just think maybe the styles and the methods are going to change. But It is about struggle. That's what our story is: struggle, perseverance. In the end, we will win. But I think sometimes people look at things and think it's going to happen faster than it does. You look at one of the most successful ethnic groups in this country, and they're ethnic and racial, which are Jewish Americans. So Jewish people have been dealing with anti-Semitism for 5,000 years. So even though they've accomplished a lot, they're a lot of professionals, they're very successful, you still see the swastikas. And one thing the Klan always does is they don't just say get rid of the Negroes, they lump the Jews and the Negroes and the foreigners and everybody. So they're still dealing with it after 5,000 years. It's in some ways the oldest hatred. The color prejudice we're experiencing today is within the past 600 years. The Romans, the Greeks, they looked at African people, particularly the Egyptians, as the standard bearers of high civilization. Most of the slaves in the Roman Empire were white, and they came from an area what is we think of now as Romania, and they were Slavic peoples, which is where the word slave comes from. It wasn't about color then. And so if Jewish people have been dealing with it for this period of time, they've made progress, they're successful, but they're still dealing with prejudice and discrimination. Maybe not on the same level or the same type we are, but it's just something that we have to be aware of. It's going to take time. But knowing that, I think it just makes us more committed to keep the struggle going.
Sure. So all that being said, and very, very informational, you sound very adept at the knowledge and the history. Marching and marches, are they effective in 2018?
I think they are, because again, the politicians look at these young people. Some of them are going to be old enough to vote. The young people are influencing their parents. And I don't think the politicians can tell which of those people won't be able to vote. And again, the first thing a politician wants to do is to get re-elected.
Right.
And as we were talking before this session, you mentioned that some of the young people's motives are being attacked.
That's right.
Again, this is where history comes in. There were actually people who said that Martin Luther King, that the civil rights protesters, that the children were communist-led, that essentially it was because of outside agitators that people didn't want to ride in the back of the bus, that they didn't want to go to inferior schools, that they didn't want inferior housing, that left alone America did not have a Negro problem, that our folks are happy and we treat them like family. We call them auntie and uncle. But it's them agitators, it's the communists, it's the people who hate America, who want to stir up the Negroes and make them demand equality. I think it's the same thing with these young people who are marching. One of the things I'm so proud of them, is that some of them made the connection and they spoke and they said, even the white students, we are speaking on behalf of the black women who have been killed and no one pays attention to them. I think it gets back to how much are we valued in American society. And one of the reasons I tell folks to study the history, to know your history, is because even if America does not value us the way we should, we need to value ourselves. It is very hard being black in America, and knowing your history is a part of therapy. It helps you to stay sane in a society that, if you're not careful, can make you go crazy.
Did you hear that 11-year-old girl, sister, I think young lady, she was from Virginia.
That's right.
She gave that powerful speech, and addressed just that, referencing the black women who had been murdered, and she called them by name, and she spoke so eloquently. I'm going to see if I can pull that up and maybe run a clip of it before we end tonight. Sure. But
and your lines are open for calls, right?
Yes. 240-719-2560. Absolutely. Please call in. So I don't know if I heard the actual answer. So then, is Black History Month still, is it necessary? Is it effective? I know there's multiple questions there, but
I think the answer is yes. So I'll start off by saying, one, we are not in a post-racial America. I never want to live in a post-racial America. I think of America as a collage made up of different people, different colors, and each of them has a story. Each of them adds a flavor and a spice to America. But what I want us to do is move beyond where being black is something negative. that black is something that is being celebrated, that our lives are valued, that we are seen and recognized for the contributions we've made to America, that we're not receiving it, we haven't received it. But the way it works is that if you want people to really know your story, you have to tell it. You can't leave your story to be told by other people.
Sure.
And so the first thing we have to do is to know it ourselves. And then when we know our value, when we know our worth, when we know our contributions, even if the larger society tries to tell us that we are not valuable, that we are not worthy of saving or protecting or treating equally, then we know that's not true. So that we do not internalize negative values. And when you feel good about yourself, when you know who you are, where you know where you're from, it also helps you to have an idea of where you're going. And in the end, that's how you win. It gives you a vision of where you want to go based upon where you've been.
Wonderful. Wow. And so your work, is it in that area? Is it in the area of African American history or?
African American history, working with groups, supporting groups. And if I could, I'd like to just put a plug in very quickly for a friend of mine, Abdul Rahman Muhammad. He's doing the Malcolm X Historical Excursion bus. It's a coach bus tour, and it's going to be held on May the 19th. For more information, people can call or text 202-276-1333, 202-276-1333. It's the Malcolm X Historical Excursion or coach bus tour. This gentleman, I've worked with him for decades, and he is one of the foremost authorities on the assassination of Malcolm X. And a lot of people don't realize that Malcolm X actually was a minister at the mosque in D.C. for 2 years. So Malcolm X has a connection to Washington, D.C., and on the tour they will go up to the mosque in Harlem where Malcolm X was a minister. They'll start at the mosque in Washington. They'll take you to the Audubon Ballroom where he was assassinated.
Audubon Ballroom
Audubon
in New York.
Ballroom in New York. And so it's an all-day, I think it's about a 14-hour tour, but they can call that number for more information. And for anyone who wants to know more about Malcolm X and see some of the sites or the places where he lived and that influenced him, then this tour is for you.
Well, I've got a friend, as a matter of fact, that I've had on the show, Don Folden. He actually runs a DC Black tour here in the city, and this guy is sold out for getting the word out about the history of our city. And he does a fantastic job. And I can give you, I was actually getting ready to look his information up, but I can give that to you as well. If you're interested in the DC Black Tours, my friend Don Folden, you guys may have seen him here on the show. His phone number is 202-340-2017. Give him a call and let him know that the show, In the End We Win, suggested that you give him a call, and he'll be glad to take you around here in the DC area and talk about, some of the stuff behind the scenes that people aren't very familiar with. So, wow. That's great stuff.
Time is going by quickly.
It runs.
Yes, it does.
I mean, and we were talking earlier about taking that break. So now you can see why sometimes the break is good and then sometimes the break isn't. But I applaud you. I thank you for coming on to the show and speaking to us tonight, this evening.
And I thank you for allowing me to be here.
Absolutely.
I've got to do a shout out for Ron.
Uh-oh.
Our technician, the man
right.
who's making this show possible, who's making us look good, and then your producer, who I have the privilege of working with in another capacity.
Right.
And so I just like to thank her for also putting me in touch with you.
Right.
And so for the audience, I just want to say struggle, perseverance, and as Kwame Ture, known to many people as Stokely Carmichael, would always say, organize, organize, organize. The struggle for freedom, justice, and equality continues. It begins with you and me.
Right.
All right.
So I appreciate it. We've still got a couple of minutes.
Couple minutes.
I just
All right.
want to. So, is there anything that you're doing? I know you you have a lot of time spent with the Toastmasters.
Toastmasters. What I'd like to do is, because I don't want to mix the issues.
Sure.
At some point, should you ever ask me to come back, you have my contact, you have my email, and if people like, they can plug me and ask him to have me back too. But I would do a separate show on the power of public speaking. And that is something that in the future I will also be doing as a business enterprise, is in terms of professional speaking, coaching, and working with people on that. But that is a show for in and of itself. But I can tell people that the ability to communicate effectively, clearly, and concisely empowers you. And when you are empowered in one area of your life, you are empowered in others. And so it allows things like this show to go forward. You change the way you speak, the way you communicate, you change your world.
Oh, wow. Because I've always, as a matter of fact, our pastor has always said, and we attend Spirit of Faith Christian Center, shout out to Pastor Mike and Dee Dee Freeman, you are addressed by the way that you dress. So then is your speech, obviously I assume then that the speech and your communication skills will kind of further the folks that you run into, and it'll force them then to just treat you and handle you a certain way.
It also helps you to express yourself, the ideas, your thoughts, to communicate better with people.
Sure.
And I think that people don't quite understand just how powerful the spoken word is, and it's Proverbs 18:12 that says the power of life and death.
That's right.
Is in the tongue.
It's in the tongue. That's right.
The power of life and death is in the tongue. And exactly what that means and how that translates to public speaking, I'll leave a placeholder there. And at some point, you get someone to cancel out. You call me up on short notice. I'll be here, and we can pick it up from there.
Gotcha. Okay, so we're going to wrap it up here, guys. But I've got a 2.5 minute video of this young lady from the March for Our Lives from this past weekend, and I thought it was just so impactful how eloquently she spoke. If we can cue that up, I'm going to hit go right now. And I'd like for you all to just participate in this. Is that on me?
Me and my friend Carter led a walkout at our elementary school on the 14th. We walked out for 18 minutes, adding a minute to honor Cortland Arrington, an African-American girl who was the victim of gun violence in her school in Alabama after the Parkland shooting. I am here today to represent Cortland Arrington. I am here today to represent Hadia Pendleton. I am here today to represent Tiana Thompson, who at just 16 was shot dead in her home here in Washington, D.C. I am here today to acknowledge and represent the African-American girls whose stories don't make the front page of every national newspaper. Whose stories don't lead on the evening news. I represent the African-American women who are victims of gun violence, who are simply statistics instead of vibrant, beautiful girls that full of potential. For far too long, these names, these black girls and women, have been just numbers. I'm here to say never again for those girls too. I am here to say that everyone should value those girls too. My friends and I might still be 11, and we might still be in elementary school, but we know life isn't equal for everyone, and we know what is right and wrong. We also know that we stand in the shadow of the Capitol, and we know that we have 7 short years until we too have the right to vote. So I am here today to honor the words of Toni Morrison. If there is a book that you want to read but it hasn't been written yet, you must be the one to write it. I urge everyone here and everyone who hears my voice to join me in telling the stories that aren't told. To honor the girls, the women of color who were murdered at disproportionate rates in this nation. I urge each of you to help me write the narrative for this world and understand so that these girls and women are never forgotten. Thank you.
That's phenomenal. That's amazing. And there are individuals out there who say that these kids are being put up by politicians on the left or by I don't know, folks who just have the money to put them up, to put them out there. But the passion in her voice and how she, articulated that, to me, isn't something that is taught to her in that short time span to put this event together. And I think that part is, where these adults who are saying that are doing our youth a disservice.
They're doing our youth a disservice. They're doing our country a disservice. I can't even believe we're having that discussion. I heard a young lady say last week as she was getting ready to go to the Georgia State House to ask them to pass laws restricting access to guns. She said, it's not complicated. Keep us alive. I think one of the rights that all students have, that all of us should have, is the right not to be killed. So questioning the motives of students as to why they want to protest, not to become a statistic, why not to become subject to gun violence, you have to question the motive of who would even raise that question and why. Who would question a young person saying, I want to live to be your age?
Right. And I find it interesting. You mentioned something before we came onto the show, before we started the show, that if you as the government is forcing me to be in school, then why is it that you are not making it important to protect me while I'm there?
That's right.
And that's I don't know if people have heard it put that way or have thought about that, but that's an interesting perspective, and it makes sense. It absolutely makes sense. And these are tough times, man.
These are tough times, but I think it was Reverend Schuler used to say, tough times don't last, but tough people do. So the bottom line is we persevere, we work together, we help each other out. Martin Luther King said life's most urgent and persistent question is, what are you doing for others? So with this show, you're sharing knowledge, you're helping us learn, you're giving us some information that in the end we will what?
Win.
We will win.
And you too. So we're going to wrap it up right there. We're going to leave it right there. Thank you guys for tuning in. We didn't get any calls. However, it's all good. Hopefully you guys were all just taking notes and just listening and whatever. I applaud you guys just for tuning in. Thank you for making this show a success.
And if you stayed awake, thank you. I appreciate that too. And if you fell asleep, I hope you didn't snore.
So we look forward to seeing you guys right back here next week, same time, 8:15 p.m. We're going to have another awesome show for you. I can assure you of that. If you're not getting anything out of these shows, then I think there may be something wrong with you, for real, because we've had some individuals on all perspectives, all spectrums that I believe that one thing you could have taken away from each and every show. So thank you all again for tuning in. My name is Curtis, and in the end, we will win. Good night.
Before I even face the fight, not moved by what I see. I walk by faith and not by sight.